We're very happy to have here with us today Vermeiren and Dieter, partners at 51 and 48, and we're hoping to speculate a bit with you guys about the future of our infrastructures. So as we all know, our world is constantly changing. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and urban growth are only a few of the drivers that push for radical transformations, and yet we're still confronted with old infrastructures from the 20th century and an infrastructural landscape that has clearly become obsolete. At the same time, the recent national and European austerity policies focus on balanced budgets, which results in less reinvestment in our current infrastructure. So the question arises now as to what to do with them, what to do with all this infrastructure. Should we demolish and start anew, or should we adapt? And in your design practice, you have developed a dynamic strategy of adaptive infrastructure. So our first question would be if you could explain to us a bit of what adaptive infrastructure is.
I think the notion of adaptive infrastructure or infrastructure in general is how can it answer certain needs, and needs that we know change over time, sometimes quite dramatically. Where if you say that infrastructure of the 20th century has become obsolete, it mostly has to do with taking a snapshot of society. It needs its certain capacity, growth, and all these things, and to then produce something which is actually super inflexible to answer that need. And that results into the sort of obsoleteness as we experience it today. I think both in the planning process of infrastructure, the questions should always be put forward in what are possible alternative futures, not only the one we live in, and not only the one for people, but also an ecological system and other things. And then the second question, which we a lot of times ask ourselves, is related to the something in between the scarcity of resources, but also the way how you can reprogram something which makes using the resource more argumented, or gives it reason to invest into infrastructure. And I think there, if you look at water infrastructure and how it is dimensioned or shaped, a lot of projects are already, a lot of projects that have been designed even in the 20th century of riverscapes, etc., show today that due to the sort of technical solution, it becomes very difficult to cope with the demands of today. And they go more to natural solutions because they know that a natural solution answers the needs of today, but can also function into the future.
Mm.
Maybe to add to that, I think inherent to the approach of adaptive infrastructure is the change of meaning of things, in the sense that we often in projects rather advise to look differently at a certain object, a certain infrastructure, instead of forming it immediately or forming a certain infrastructure to what Harold says, the current needs of today. By looking differently at something, sometimes you don't have to change it and you can use it in a different way. And in general, I think that's a shift where you see that in the 20th century, people were very much forming society and creating the infrastructures that society needed. While now I think we're living in a time where we more inhabit a certain environment where which partly is natural, but very much is also human built. And we don't, or at least that's I think our belief, we don't need to completely reform it, reshape it again another time and use again a lot of resources to do so. So just to change glasses, to change a view on a highway, on a viaduct, on a train system, you can do so much without actually changing the form of it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe to be a little bit more specific, like regarding your specific strategy, maybe it's good here to bring up one of your projects. It's the Atelier Deep Geothermia. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about this one and what was your approach, and maybe also So you already talked about how adaptive infrastructure can contribute to current challenges, but maybe make it a little bit more specific. And also, on the other hand, if there were certain situations where your strategy couldn't actually rely to certain challenges.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good example where it was quite challenging to form a new type of energy system, the use of deep geothermia in Limburg, which is a new thing. Like it's a new technology that was actually very much in development while we were doing the study on the spatial impact. And from the engineer's point of view, was not linked so much to what was happening above ground, what was happening above this source of heat that was in Limburg underground. And again, there, I think our approach was to embrace this new technology, because it is indeed a sustainable form of heat production and energy production, but also look very much at what was already there, which systems were shaping the landscape, were shaping the daily lives of people living in this region, and somehow mold the new technology into that spatial social system. Very concretely, it was the old railway built between the different mine sites in the early 20th, mid 20th century, which could be the line on which also the new heat redistribution was connected, which you actually see on this image, which was a way of finding efficiencies, because this old railway was still publicly owned, which made it more easy to implement a new large-scale heat system, but also more, like I said, more embedded in the landscape as a new technology.
And not because you said also that you refer to this already existing train infrastructure as a social one. So our next question would be, if we look at the next slide, that we have noticed that in your projects, such as this street we're seeing now in the project of flyover in Ghent, you tend to go beyond the engineering aspects of infrastructures, and you turn them into public spaces where people can share experiences and create social interactions. Could you explain a bit more about the role that social infrastructure play in your design strategy?
Maybe shortly. Of course, this photo you see is an initiative of the city of Ghent, with whom we were collaborating while doing the flyover. It's not an initiative of 51M4E, but it was a context in which our approach was very much was working very well, because they were also looking at infrastructure in the same way, in the way of what we call adaptive infrastructure. To respond to the question of social infrastructure, in this case, it was very clear that the highway in the city had an important like role in the daily lives of people living in Ghent. It was a futuristic utopian project bringing prosperity to the city in the 60s, 70s. For some, it was a horror. For others, it was a dream. So the study that we did in Ghent was actually also collecting all of those meanings and starting to make scenarios with the different meanings that we mapped with the people living around and living in Ghent. And it was partly the source material for spatial scenarios, but also partly the source material for a campaign that then was done by the city, showing those stories, hanging big posters on the infrastructure of the bruggenbouwers, the bridge builders, where the link between daily lives of people was made very explicitly in this on this infrastructure.
Yeah, and maybe also linking the last project of deep geothermia to this one, and the question, when did your approach didn't work? Because it's also an interesting question. Infrastructure is a lot of times judged or planned based on performance, something super functional, and it also needs to be quantified, not only in offering solutions, but also in budgets, etc. And if you look at the project of deep geothermia, which actually had a more spatial driver, using an old infrastructure, but also creating experiences around it. In a vision, of course, the link between performance and experience is very easily made. But in reality, due to the structures, the planning principles we have, it is super difficult to actually go and realize something like this. Project of deep geothermia is actually now in the process of linking the old railway track to a bicycle highway, which is in the way linked also to another type of infrastructure which is lacking today. But it still loses a bit the possibility which is shown here of a very performing energy system and the notion of experience. And this is maybe also in the viaduct where infrastructure a lot of times has such a potential as a leverage because the investment is huge. And a lot of times, due to the fact that it's only judged and designed and implemented based on performance, it completely misses the opportunity of also creating an experience or added value for people. And this is in a way the sort of, if you check in if you look at the viaduct, the sort of one-on-one representation of how it could also function for something else than the performance factor of the car, for example. Where if you allow people, you can do a lot of things under it, on top of it, next to it. And I think the test case, which indeed the city of Ghent set up, was a very good example of how infrastructure is not only based on performance and performativity.
So if we look at this other aspect of infrastructure, not just this part, but also the more social aspect, as you described now, would you say that this aspect is evoking new places and new typologies, for example, in your work?
I'm not sure if they are new, but they're probably, a public space on a viaduct. If you look at history, is not something new. It has been there. I think in 20th century we started to zone and to plan in a way that, like we did with the CM principles, like we did in the city, a business district, a housing district, a factory district, all separate zones. I think we did the same thing with road infrastructure and with public spaces in a way that in the end, like we realize now, is not very interesting because you lose all the hybridity, you lose the connections between different uses. And I think what we are looking for is to install it back to get different users connected in public space. I wouldn't say it's a completely new purpose.
Now, to also continue on that, what Dieter says is very true. Like a lot of people in the past, but still are thinking very much in subdivided spaces. In the past, maybe more on a large scale, but now also on a small scale, because it makes things work on paper, but not really in reality. And I think what we try to implement is a more relational way of thinking, of connecting things that before were completely separated. So it's not immediately finding new typologies, but it's more about putting things in perspective and certain relations. And maybe we can share a screen and give some examples of it. But so it's a project that we're actually also doing in the north of Belgium, and it's just a sketch, but it maybe illustrates the idea what we said about making things more relational. And it was a question we got in a bigger project of an area which is really suffering under the lack of connectivity, and where the main project or the problem was car connection and public transport connection, but where as short-term actions we try to realize also soft connections for bikes and pedestrians in order to kind of create a shift, a mental shift for people also to not only use the car to make their daily movements. And in this question of a bicycle bridge to cross a very busy road, which is represented in the sketch by these two black lines, we were thinking, how can we represent here that it's not only about this bicycle bridge and going from A to B, but it's also about creating a specific experience. And just to go fast, our proposal now is to actually create, as the bicycle bridge itself, a more enclosed structure, which disconnects itself from the car infrastructure, which is below and quite violent, but where in the beginning of the bridge, it actually starts in a very beautiful landscape. So there you have the experience. And then it actually creates the tube more or less over the car infrastructure. And then it ends up again where we create this land hill, which again, where you can experience the landscape aspect, together also with the reuse of an industrial hall, and where we try to create a sort of landscape staircase to the bottom, which then connects the bus stop. To maybe make it a bit more specific, so here actually is it's right next to a very beautiful nature reserve where you start on a bridge. Then here you have the more enclosed system. This is the land body where it lands and the connection to the bus stop. And actually it was a former industrial terrain, and we actually use the land body on top of the industrial terrain, but we keep a couple of buildings like this big industrial hall, which you see here, where actually the bicycle bridge lands through. So you have the sort of link between the landscape and the industrial heritage. And yeah, so we started with relational design. So it's maybe not so much on inventing typologies, but creating new relations.
Yeah, I think that's what we often do is by looking at the friction between different things, that space is produced, and not so much by creating a new object. And I think the bridge is indeed a good example of how this can be translated into space.
Sometimes when looking at your project, it seems like they have a certain correction mechanism to certain infrastructures that become obsolete or that don't work well or that are kind of becoming a border. So do you think it's actually, did you ever think of your strategy of adaptional infrastructures as a starting point of a project? So like on tabula rasa, or do you say that's not even fair to say, because basically there's always something there already, and it's all about like creating new relationalities about these objects that are to be found?
Yes, I would say the second. I don't think there is a blank space. Even in what they call greenfield development, there is already so much there. You have often a whole natural system. So I think that's very hard to imagine something tabula rasa.
And the tabula rasa is indeed something which really opposes to our strategy or way of thinking, because it starts from nothing, where I don't think it excludes how we work to be very radical. It doesn't mean you can't really turn a system or an existing way of working upside down, which we sometimes do, but it does always start from elements which are already put in place over the past decades or centuries or whatever.
To rephrase the question maybe a little bit, so do you think like the idea of adaptiveness can still be a starting point for a project?
Yes. Yeah, I think I understand better. Yeah, we do also, for instance, completely new builds where maybe on a small scale you are speaking about the tabula rasa, even though you're of course inside of a city or inside of a context where you have a lot of relations. But you can also then think smartly how you build a structure, how you build an urban block in a way that it makes relations, that it's also environmentally more interesting to reuse when the use that we design for maybe leaves the building and another type of use comes in. So the whole idea of circularity is something that is more and more inside of the discussions in the office, how we go beyond the what we know in terms of building structures to some things that are indeed very smartly designed nowadays to survive on the long term. I think the World Trade Center project and the ZIN is an example where we push that, or where we are pushing that to ways that we never have designed before. So that's something that is quite interesting at the moment, I think, in architecture, the flexible structures approach.
Yeah, but it's indeed a good question, because it's easy to criticize things of the past and to give them a new life, or maybe easier, but to also give yourself that attitude for the things you produce, maybe more from scratch. It's something to keep in mind. And within planning of infrastructure, to also take the example of the bicycle bridge project, which is one side of the project and the short-term initiatives, while on the other side, where we really plan for the future in 20-30 years, we now look into, for example, how can the current car infrastructure, which needs to be replaced, actually also liberate space for the natural valleys which are present due to the topography. And it's actually very difficult to think, do we design this natural valley big enough, or do we give it enough space for it to function in 100 years? It's a very difficult question, because we don't know. But it pushes us to always think of as many alternative futures as we can, and then take a decision now that allows as much as possible for that. And it does change our proposals in, do we provide a tunnel or not? Because a tunnel is very fixed, and something in the open air in a way is less. But the open air solution produces sometimes today still a more violent impact, while in the future it doesn't. So it's always this balancing between, what do we provide today and how will it function in the future?
Okay, now we would like, I think we'd like to shift a little bit the questions, and we would like to move into the actors. In recent years, we can observe an inflation of the word interdisciplinary planning, right? And so instead of the sectoral planning, where the aim was that the experts in the field would propose educated solutions, now we have a new hybrid approach, which includes actor analysis and possibly sometimes even scenario planning as a crucial step. So looking at your involvement in the Brussels World Trade Center, could you tell us a bit about your approach, your interdisciplinary approach, and to be more specific, how much of it is it integrating different people to the process, versus how and when do you have to engage yourselves into different roles?
Maybe that's a good question for Dieter.
It's quite layered question. So maybe I can explain what happens, and then return to your question on how we are positioned. So we moved in as an office in 2017 into a vacant office tower in the World Trade Center in the North District. And gradually the tower, also through our involvement, became a place where many actors started to use space. An architectural school moved in, an architectural biennial, artists were working there, students were coming to study, and it became a place where a lot of debate about the future of this district was starting to happen. From a very closed building where you had a front door and you could only go by appointment, it became a more open place where you had debates, you had parties, you had all kinds of things happening at a certain point. And I think our presence there, or the presence of all those people there, they strengthened some sort of interdisciplinary discussion about the district. It was not much of a strategy to do that, but more something that happened. And because of this presence, because of the meeting in the corridor, in the elevator, on a certain event, ideas arose. Of course, and this was valuable. This was quite interesting to see that on a place that was in transformation, the doors were opened to new people, to younger people, to engage in a discussion. Retrospectively, it was also still quite a limited spectrum of people that were involved. It was mainly creative, mainly highly educated people that got into those events, that got into these discussions. So you could also question the inclusivity of what happened in the World Trade Center, which I think needs to be addressed in the way how we do planning, how we do this participation that now is almost a current job that we have to take up if you do urban design. I think always this question is there. In how far you are really talking to users and talking to types of intelligence that you need to be talking to. And World Trade Center was, I think, a sort of large-scale experiment and proof of new types of methods, but also very much the limits of those new methods. Mm-hmm. So as an actor, we were a driving force because of this presence, which I think is a very crucial concept, and also something that we can learn from in urban planning. To be present in a district means a lot, and it's actually very difficult to get the right approach if you're not sufficiently present. But also to be still, but the other side, we were still very exclusive, and we had certain privileges that were linked to our own socioeconomical status.
Maybe also there to see which actors come in play, when is it valuable, how dialogue is set up. Where we see a big difference, and it's also normal, of course, because it's not so easy to structure, is that if you start from an initiative and let that initiative grow and then in a way formulate its own projects or needs or problems, it is very different than from a more top-down approach. Start from saying, this is the problem and we will solve it, or we have to solve it. Mm-hmm. Because stating the problem in itself is already a project. And a lot of times it is an accumulation of sometimes something that is completely uninvestigated, sometimes something that is completely analytical. And a lot of times when we enter a project through the stating of a problem and they look for a team to solve it, to say it very simple, during the development, we reformulate the problem, and a lot of times it's very difficult to change then the perception of people. Where in the North District, I think a lot of people still, there is a problem there, but for many people, the problem is very different. For an investor, the problem is a huge amount of square meters, which can almost only always be filled in by a big company or by an administration that takes it up. For migrants, which here this is also in a way sort of a rival place in Brussels. The problem is the fact that, for example, they can't be in the surroundings of the North Station because it's highly public, which makes them having to flee to the margins in a way. For us as creators, the problem is, or as city inhabitants, it's of course that this place is vacant. There is nothing to do here. I came to work on Sunday and literally you have to kind of look around, where can I get some food? Because the model isn't there. So through an initiative, stating the problems instead of first stating the problems and then ask for a project is something I think will change the actor field, or what people should do in the future, quite drastically.
Yeah, the diversity of actors can also facilitate to make places like this urban again. I think that's one of the things that, also linking to the previous questions, similarly to a viaduct that is only used by cars, this district was for 30 years only used by commuters coming in at 9 o'clock and going out at 5 o'clock, which was an uninteresting model even for them using it. So I think what was the great aim here is by allowing people moving into vacant spaces, get this hybridity of encounters, of meeting spaces that wasn't completely thought of in a functional way as they thought it in the 70s and 60s. So it comes a bit back to this, I think the value that we see in diversity and diversity of use.
Maybe thinking of these different actors that are coming together, and also what you said before, like when you were on site, it gave you a very different insight into the whole district and also into your project itself. But you also sometimes apply different methodology of interdisciplinary approaches. So how do you actually like integrate the knowledge you're generating, like regarding these different actors, actually into your design process? And like, are you quantifying these information, so to say, to integrate it?
Well, we have, I think we've set up some methods to from a large pool of informations, of opinions, of data, of all sorts of source that we work with. We've started to develop some tools, some instruments that allow to make it again comprehensible. Like recently, we started a lot to work with a kind of value chart, something where on a quite high level in a project, you start to distinguish which values can be shared in a certain project. And then based on those values, you can build different scenarios, and you can even, like you say, measure in what way one scenario helps the one value to be realized or not. So it's something that we also borrowed from more social sciences. That's one tool. I think another dimension of this integrating different opinions is to set up a dynamic, which is not complete, it's never mathematical, but it can be very powerful to really spend a lot of time thinking about the space in which you bring people together, so that it's something that creates an energy, creates something that can continue in the following steps and can create a sort of coalition around the project. So that's another, I think, approach that we have. We are not we work together with people that really do multi-criteria analysis, where they really check and value the different aspects of a project, both social and technical. But it's not something that we do, and also not what we're very interested in. But it's sometimes interesting to know those measurements.
Mm-hmm. It also comes down a lot to working in a very transparent way. Because in a way, working with actors comes down to listening and being able to understand. But it's true that if it becomes diverse and sometimes also complex, it needs to be insightful on how you integrate it. And in a lot of projects, we try to shift in between working very fast or taking some more time. And then sometimes we see, for example, administrative stakeholders on Monday, like the people from the city or the government, etc. The day after, we see people from the communes, more local inhabitants. The day after, again, maybe more people from transport companies and all these things, or from the private sector. And then at the end, we always do the exercise of going from scenarios to maybe one preferential proposal with each one of them. And at the end of the week, we present actually the outcome of this, where everybody sees from one another what they would do. And then we try to make a synthesis out of that. And there you also don't have to be scared to play out the tension of certain things. And by separating different groups and not seeing just people as individuals, of course seeing people as individuals, but not saying because that person screams the loudest, his voice is heard the most, but seeing people more as groups and their interests, I think it allows us to also translate it to concrete proposals.
Yeah, I believe that we as designers, we should be very good at listening and setting up agendas and settings where you can actually listen and integrate a lot, but there is still in the integrating into what sometimes we call like future images, toekomstbeelden. That's where also the expertise lies. That's something that you can't give to stakeholders, to participants in a session. It's actually a quite it's something that you actually need to train, how to translate all of these diverse messages into some images that have the power to be recognized by those stakeholders, and then to live longer afterwards. In that sense, we are not, we're maybe different from other participatory approaches where people are really designing all together. I think there is still a lot of design involved in our in-house work, and then presented again and fed to the entire group.
Now, I think we would like to change a little bit again and talk about, we were very interested when we were looking at your projects about the scalability of these projects and the scalability of your adaptive infrastructure strategy. If we look at the Over the Ring project in Antwerp, we can see that you subdivided the area into smaller clusters, and you found afterwards specific points of interventions, so to say, along the highway. And then, for example, if we look at much bigger projects like the Istanbul city expansion, so we look at both of these, and we were actually thinking, how does this shift between the different scales transform your understanding of the traditional master plan? Mm-hmm. Or if it does, and
Good that you bring it up. Actually, for the Antwerp Ring Road, to separate the ring into different zones, it was not our idea. It was the idea of the office responsible of coordinating the entire process. Mm-hmm. But separating a bigger question or a bigger framework into smaller aspects is also something that we a lot of times work with, but it's maybe also interesting to talk about what didn't work well on using that method in the ring road and what is actually valuable on it. So in a way, if you subdivide a bigger question into smaller concrete elements, it allows you to add more specificity to the proposal, to also make it more diverse in what it can answer to and make it more comprehensible. In the ring road, for example, the reason why it was subdivided into different zones had to do with two things. One, it was about the ring road. So there was a sort of clear division in between that node and that node. There is a piece of highway. But it was also based on neighborhoods. The fact that you had neighboring neighborhoods next to each other and they were actually linked to a specific space around it. What didn't work, for example, if we went to look to the water system, it was very much beyond our segment, but beyond the zone that we worked on. But due to the segmentation, it didn't allow us actually to work or to shape something which really also addressed the scale of the entire infrastructure, the entire ring road. So I think subdividing a bigger question into smaller ones, you should always see it more as a framework rather than it should be an end result. And if you look at this image here, it was more on sort of mapping, but also projecting developments along the ring road, which were already happening, and the possible public space that would be able to glue them or glue them together. It's something that also made us look differently at the segmentation. If you, for example, think our segment was on the east side, and one of the public spaces we envisioned to connect two neighborhoods was actually on the edge of our segment. And it was very difficult within the process that was set up to all of a sudden create new boundaries or to rethink those boundaries. And that is something that I think we always keep in mind, is that setting up a framework should always allow to redefine the framework, but it should also always serve the outcome in a better way. It shouldn't be too pragmatical in a way.
The approach of addressing multiple scales at once in those large projects, often there are opportunities that can be used, or chances that can be addressed already in the much shorter term than the term that you're actually designing for. So I think here in the Ring and in other projects, we could already speak, or we chose to speak already about quick wins, about short-term interventions that could inspire municipalities, community groups to already start changing the city now, far beyond the capping of the ring would happen. And I think that's something that in those projects should be more thought through, is how an urban project can be a resource for inspiration for citizens far beyond the actual intervention. And that's something I think is very, very interesting in projects of this scale, where you really, like, maybe in the first year already a bench with the lights is realized inside of this large plan for a 50 hectares roofing of a ring, and that gradually this system can grow and public spaces are realized in an incremental way.
Actually, I have another question, like also regarding to your answer from the question before. So you said design often creates positive images for the future. And like when looking at these big scale projects, do you think it's also kind of, so would you understand it in a way that breaking down the questions also creates different types of these images, or are like all these segments in the end still feeding into one big image of the future?
Well, I think the outcome is sometimes different. What we try to create in the imagination around the project is almost always an integral view on the living environment you want to create. It will never be that we will create an imagination that shows only one aspect of everyday life, which can be a sub-project of the bigger project. If we talk about the water system, we will not create an image only representing the water system. We will try to create what it can inspire for people to live around it, to use it, how it relates to the other infrastructures surrounding it. So I think these future images always try to make the synthesis, but they will never be complete. And it's trying to, at the end, come up with a plan or a framework which integrates all the different representations which we used over time to answer to the multiplicity of imagination that we could imagine.
Yeah, I think that there is a need for future images, and maybe indeed it would have been interesting. I don't think it really happened, for sure not on the entire strip of the roofing of the ring, but those images should allow for paradoxes, for contradictions, for discussion, and not be a sort of utopian safe haven. Like the city will never be such a thing. So there is again a challenge for designers to make those futures inspiring, but also full of contradictions.
I guess that this is your answer to, if I go a little bit back about the master plan, this is your answer to the master plan, because you're trying to create not fixed, let's say, solutions, but always places of contradictions. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, maybe we can also go on with our next question. That would be like, have you ever experienced, like, when one of your project was finished, that it kind of developed over its completion, like beyond its completion, and how that's maybe also connected to these kind of paradox images you were talking about?
Well, what is maybe difficult on these large-scale planning projects that we're doing is that they're so long-term that they're still in the process of planning, and sometimes they will only be realized, or part of it will be realized in 10 years. What I think we try to do is always project things in time, and to show what is possible and what still needs to be defined, or what still could be developed onwards. If you look at projects like the rehabilitation of an old submarine bunker in the south of France, which in a way also is within the framework of adaptive infrastructure, where it was foreseen, but maybe this is something that Dieter can explain better, where it was foreseen as how can this architecture of the submarine bunker be used as a shell for different uses, and where the architecture that we proposed tried to create a dialogue with the inner programs that we suggested, but also the outside space. And I think there what is starting to become interesting is that due to the sort of duality of infill and surroundings, it is today attracting people who normally would, for example, never visit the sites. And they start to now project also different programs on it, which in the beginning were not part of the brief or were not part of the project in itself. So I think it's a good representation that if you implement something new into our built environment, so to speak, that it should always be open enough to allow different use and also allow the further development of it.
There was recently a short article about this project describing how it was more designing the marges, the margins. So where you actually created more spaces outside, like a terrace or like a possible sport fields inside the bunker, in between spaces that could be used even eventually, a bench. And I think that's true. There was not so much of a design functionally, but more the in-between spaces that could be appropriated in a more flexible manner. So yeah, maybe to go back to your question, yes, of course there are many projects. The unexpected happens, and the unexpected is also what maybe we should be allowing in architecture.
Yeah, what is nice is that if people beyond our office or our intervention start to see the project also as an opportunity for them, not just as something finished. And this is also something that's happening at Skanderbeg Square in Tirana, where there's a first intervention, or there's a certain intervention, but people surrounding it, the museum, a hotel, even people of the surrounding neighborhoods, start to all of a sudden orient their own perspective of creating a business or their daily routine as something that wasn't there before, but is starting to be installed now. And which is nice about the scale of adaptive infrastructure is that it can really address as many opportunities for other people as possible, where a smaller scale sometimes is limited to just answering the needs of the project.
And now if we fast forward a little bit into 2040, according to your opinion, what do you think, which are the infrastructures that will need most adaptation in the future because of them becoming obsolete or neglected?
Yeah, there are the evident ones because of the shift in mobility. There will be we're still at the verge of changing car infrastructure. That's clear. But at the same time, yeah, again, how much do you need to adapt this car infrastructure? How much is already there and is reusable in different ways? I think that's something that is still overlooked in a lot of infrastructure projects, changing it into other things.
Yeah, and also the notion of what infrastructure is, and that's probably also the reason why we had this moment of silence, because we had to think more on it. It's already so diverse, and there's really such a big necessity that the question almost shifts to not what infrastructure, but where this infrastructure needs to be changed, or where it's the most urgent. I think probably with all the things we are busy with at the moment, we will need to set priorities in a way. And our priorities, for example, now a lot on environments where we have big densities and a lot of people, and less on spaces which we actually created, like you said earlier, in the 20th century. But due to the lack of density or of people, they become less urgent, while actually due to infrastructure we implemented years ago, also the question raises there. So to see how can infrastructure serve a certain purpose in its multiplicity of spaces, I think that will be the biggest challenge. And there, for example, look into the case of Belgium, which is highly specific, small country, very centrally positioned in Europe. In the 70s, we actually promoted to live in the periphery around the city. Our tax system was oriented towards it, which created a huge sprawl. And if you link it to infrastructure today, which we are an extremely infrastructuralized country, we have a huge amount of roads systems and roads. We have a sewage system which is as diverse as you can imagine, going to all the outskirts of the country. To us, the biggest problem is if we need to renovate all this or make this future-proof, the cost of it is huge. So we start to notice in the formulating questions for the infrastructural landscape is where will we invest in and where will our future be? Will it be that we leave the infrastructural aspect on the countryside and let it renaturalize and let it be on itself and invest in the cities? Or how do we deal with this tension of what we created in the past and to deal with it in the future?
I think this large infrastructure, like the road network in Belgium, which is extremely small grains and it goes until every little housing estate, this will probably be transformed rather in a bottom-up way, in a way where inhabitants start to change their streets, and in local communities they will start to transform it into ways that also fit the 21st century lifestyles more. And we have a quite interesting project on such an approach, which in itself seems almost anecdotal, but I think there is a systemic dimension to starting to change your own street. So this is a project in Leuven where, together with a local association of inhabitants, we are working on the demineralization of a street. This is an action where the narrowing of the street is simulated one day in summer, and where also the gardens between the houses are starting to be shared and less space is taken up by parking lots, where you can also share a meal on in those public spaces. So the bottom-up transformation of infrastructure, I think, will be crucial in realizing the shift in a sustainable way, and maybe indeed investing in certain places where the density is high and where this approach probably will be impossible to realize. I think that's from a policy point of view the more interesting approach.
Also, to go beyond these typical urban infrastructures, also the ones you just showed now, and maybe also to speculate, like, have you ever thought of like how your strategy of adaptive infrastructures can also be applied to infrastructure, like maybe infrastructure we don't necessarily understand as infrastructure today, but maybe, for example, agricultural land, or for example, energy plants? And have you ever kind of touched on that topic?
There is very few places in our daily context that are not urbanized, so it's hard to think of a place that is not urban in one way or another. Our more rural environments are so heavily privatized and taken up by infrastructure that it's a bit difficult to imagine such a space.
Maybe also like the infrastructures that are not inhabited at the moment, for example, like energy infrastructure, for example, that's not creating a space itself, but that's more like an object in space.
Well, maybe to not address energy infrastructure, because it's something that we are dealing with, but maybe not the most specific one. But if you take industrial environments, which are in a way also a type of infrastructure which is very low inhabited, but also requires a shift in thinking. What we encounter as a challenge for ourselves is that a lot of times, if we play out this role of relational thinking, of using or relational design, of using infrastructure also to serve people, it becomes very difficult if an infrastructure is indeed not really serving people, but is more serving its own purpose. And the relations are very difficult to address there. And with the specific topic of industrial terrains, which is something that we have been working on also a couple of times, we try to look for how can this infrastructure become more performative, but also interlinked in terms of the use of space or the use of land. And proposals like, for example, stacking industrial spaces rather than to just spread them out is something that works in spaces where land is quite valuable, then the economical system works. But where it becomes completely ridiculous in a financial perspective, if you do it at in environments where the land is actually not worth that much. So what we're trying to discover now, in a way, is which mechanisms in this relational thinking are there beyond just serving the people, but also serving just the scarcity of land.
And I think there are also a lot of great examples where those traditionally non-accessible infrastructures are, if you think it through, quite accessible, like the water reservoirs in Medellin that are usable for as a public space. That's actually a strategy that we tested in the ring. And then other environments which maybe because of safety reasons can't be used by humans could ideally be biodiverse environments where birds and animals could live. So I think there is a lot of potential maybe in those spaces as well to look at different layers of use and not only human but also for non-humans.
Yeah, that's actually very interesting. In the ring road, there were actually a lot of ecological islands in a way, and they were created because of the non-accessibility due to safety hazards or whatever. And they, for example, existed around the railroad or around energy plants or whatever. And it was very interesting to find links in between them to then create actually a bigger network of those spaces that serve in itself their purpose, but also another purpose of the ecological connection.
Okay, very interesting. But you mentioned non-human inhabitants. This is very interesting. Okay, so since we're in the future now, I will try to ask a question about future trends like digitalization. Because if we see these trends as an influencing one, also in the realm of planners and urban designers. So the approach we often take is informed usually by our personal values. And we would like to talk about your position somehow towards these new trends. So the question would be, do you think that digital platforms offer other insights, and how can they become a tool? Could participation apps play a role in the future in your work as well?
Yeah, I think they are quite important in understanding the world today. The way that we learn from the digital platforms is become part of daily life. So it will also become part of how we use infrastructure, how we use the resources that we have. There are a couple of interesting initiatives in Flanders of mapping trage wegen, slow roads, through those digital platforms where information is shared, and the different layers that we were talking about in infrastructure can be mapped through those digital platforms. Of course, like all things, it also has its disadvantages again of being quite quite segregating in a way. Like how inclusive is such a digital platform is again the question, I think, but their legislation can help, and I think should help to actually make use of digital tools to create that relational approach on a larger scale. The example that I just showed is just because of proximity, because people live there, that this happens. I can imagine that by using a digital platform, that this can be scaled up to a larger movement, for instance. So there is a potential for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on the other side, next to gathering information, I think in a lot of infrastructural projects we do, the management side around it is also really shifting, because we're in infrastructure a lot of times, if something needs more space or there's a problem which asks capacity, you in a way give it, but it's very one-dimensional, because we know that a water system functions, for example, very different in summer than in winter or in fall. You know that a road system functions very different in the weekends than during the week, or during rush hour or not rush hour. You know that an energy system also needs to be able to answer to demands very differently from holidays to non-holidays, or from season to season. So I think if we have an infrastructure and we're able to program it in a way that allows us to actually take up less space but make it more performative in a way and more versatile, I think that will be the biggest shift in the future. And there, even road systems or networks which are extremely complex are actually very easily manageable if you implement a digital system rather than to just leave the infrastructure as it is.
Mm. This is kind of also touching on the topic of big data, basically, and also location intelligence. So we would like to know what you're thinking about this approach, like for example by the application of phone data, and if talking about big data, we would also like to know what it would need for a design practice, basically, to adopt these kind of data and to integrate it, and also what it does to the role of a designer.
Yeah, in our current practice, it's often analyzed by engineers, translated into scenarios, and then it's picked up by us. So we are quite unexperienced to work with big data.
Well, what we work with quite recently and a lot is more the open source aspect of things, and to be able to access information which normally takes a procedure to get into. I think it will be something that will be, for one, more part of our education also, and then due to that also due to part of our implementation. And what would it need? I think what is difficult with this digitalization is how do you verify the information that you will actually use to shape the future. When talking to people or having a very physical interaction, maybe the data is very specific due to just having 10 people or 15 people. But the way you can verify it, you have also an emotional aspect around it. You can interact way more, which allows us to be maybe more specific to what we show. If something is digitized and in a way, because of that also as a sort of standardization, it's very difficult to interpret it, to give an interpretation to that.
I think designers and in the way that economists, for instance, work with data or exact sciences, there is a more difficult relation, I think, in design towards this field. Not impossible, but at least for sure not crystal clear how it can be used intelligently and not lead to very general solutions that are so general that they become uninteresting on a small scale. It's an interesting question, but I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Interesting that you came up with the notion of generality connected to big data, because I think that's something often is kind of neglected when thinking about it.
And I think that now we're not going to disturb you more. It's the last question. So in this last part, we would like to shift a little bit again to the users, because in your work, you emphasize adaptivity a lot, of course, but in the end, we all know that it's about users. And so we would like to ask you, if you set adaptivity as a starting point of the project, how do you think users or residents will react towards an ever-changing and flexible environment? And do you think that this requires a change in the user's behavior itself?
Yeah, I think indeed that's another shift, I think, that is happening in line with the challenges that you also named: climate change, migration, a lot of changes that are happening, and the city and the design of cities could be a way to deal with those changes. And it probably will be a mental shift, a shift in how you see it, that is necessary not to lead to any conflicts. And it's not so much that we ask the shift to happen before people can inhabit or participate in our designs. It's more that the design seems to be a method to get used to change and get into this attitude.
And a big shift, or something that we use as a starting point, is to change a bit the notion of user as well, because the connotation it brings along is that you will develop something and then afterwards they will use it. To say it very simple, but to see a user more as a co-developer in the beginning of the process also allows him afterwards to feel a certain link to what is there, and to also continue this development of it. And if you don't do that, then this entire dynamic around participation or whatever is very one-dimensional. It becomes, you are the user, I will develop something, I listen, and afterwards you can use it. So.
Yeah, and there the design shouldn't be the traditional tools like the master plan, because in many projects we see that this frightens people. That this is actually something that they don't want to step into. But if it's linked to another tool like this value framework or a master plan that is more this thing full of contradictions, then it becomes easier to step in. I think in the Reding and Hof, the demineralization project, at a certain point, the making of a plan really became the problem. Everybody opposed the plan, while the actions were very inspiring and the doing was very, very interesting. So maybe we should really question our tools and sometimes design in a different way, design the action as such without a plan, being involved as a doer. I think that's one way. Of course, it's not applicable to large projects like the Ring, where then another instrument should be developed. It's maybe not very clear, but I think architects still tend to have those sacred instruments that often don't work when you're trying to realize change.
And to see their project as an end result, which it de facto isn't.
That sums up very nicely the whole interview. And thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you for the invitation.